Volume 1, Book 5, Chapters 25 to 34 of the Life of Apollonius of Tyana. The Life of Apollonius of Tyana by Flavius Philostratus, translated by F.C. Conybeare. Volume 1, Book 5, Chapters 25 to 34. Chapter 25. And when he had gone into the temple, he was struck by the orderliness of its arrangements, and thought the reason given for everything thoroughly religious and wisely framed. But as for the blood of bulls and the sacrifices of geese and other animals, he disapproved of them, nor would he consider that they constituted repasts of the gods. And when a priest asked him what induced him not to sacrifice like the rest, "Nay, you," he replied, "should rather answer me what induces you to sacrifice in this way." The priest replied, "And who is so clever that he can make corrections in the affairs of the Egyptians?" "Any one," he answered, "with a little wisdom, if only he comes from India." "And," he added, "I will roast a bull to ashes this very day, and you shall hold communion with us in the smoke it makes. For you cannot complain if you only get the same portion which is thought enough of a repast for the gods." And as his image was being melted in the fire, he said, "Look at the sacrifice." "What sacrifice?" said the Egyptian, "for I do not see anything there." And Apollonius said, "The Lamidae, and the Taliadae, and the Clytiadae, and the oracle of the black-footed ones have talked a lot of nonsense, most excellent priest, when they went on at such length about fire, and pretended to gather so many oracles from it. For as to the fire from pine wood and from cedar, do you think it is really fraught with prophecy and capable of revealing anything, and yet not esteem a fire lit from the richest and purest gum to be much preferable? If then you had really any acquaintance with the lore of fire worship, you would see that many things are revealed in the disk of the sun at the moment of its rising." Chapter 26. With these words he rebuked and silenced the Egyptian, showing that he was ignorant of religion. But because the Alexandrians are devoted to horses, and flock into the race-course to see the spectacle, and murder one another in their partisanship, he therefore administered a grave rebuke to them over these matters, and entering the temple he said, "How long will you persist in meeting your deaths? Not in behalf of your families or of your shrines, but because you are determined to pollute the sacred precincts by entering them reeking with gore, and to slaughter one another within the walls." And Troy, it seems, was ravaged and destroyed by a single horse, which the Achaeans of that day had contrived. But your chariots and horses are yoked to your own despite, and leave you no chance of living in submission to the reins of law. You are being destroyed, therefore, not by the sons of Atreus, nor by the sons of Ajax, but by one another, a thing that the Trojans would not have done even when they were drunk. At Olympia, however, where there are prizes for wrestling and boxing, and for the mixed athletic contests, no one is slain in behalf of the athletes, though it were quite excusable if one should show an excess of zeal in the rivalry of human beings like himself. But here I see you rushing at one another with drawn swords and ready to hurl stones, all over a horse race. I would like to call down fire upon such a city as this, where amidst the groans and insulting shouts of the destroyers and the destroyed, the earth runs with blood. Can you not feel reverence for the Nile, the common mixing bowl of Egypt? But why mention the Nile to men whose gauges measure a rising tide of blood rather than of water? And many other rebukes of the same kind he addressed to them, as Damas informs us. Chapter 27. Vespasian was harboring thoughts of seizing the absolute power, and was at this time in the countries bordering upon Egypt. And when he advanced as far as Egypt, people like Dion and Euphrates, of whom I shall have something to say lower down, urged that a welcome should be given to him. For the first aristocrat, by whom the Roman state was organized, was succeeded for the space of 50 years by tyrants so harsh and cruel that not even Claudius, who reigned 13 years in the interval between them, could be regarded as a good ruler, and that, although he was 50 years of age when he succeeded to the throne, an age when a man's judgment is most likely to be sane, and though he had the reputation of being fond of culture of all kinds, nevertheless he too, in spite of his advanced age, committed many youthful follies, and gave up the empire to be devoured, as sheep devour a pasture, by silly women who murdered him because he was so indolent that though he knew beforehand what was in store for him, he would not be on his guard even against what he foresaw. Apollonius, no less than Euphrates and Dion, rejoiced in the new turn of events, but he did not make vice of them as a theme of his public utterances, because he considered such an argument too much in the style of a rhetor. When the autocrat approached the city, the priests met him before the gates, together with the magistrates of Egypt and the representatives of the different provinces into which Egypt is divided. The philosophers also were present, and all their schools. Apollonius, however, did not put himself forward in this way, but remained conversing in the temple. The autocrat delivered himself of noble and gentle sentiments, and after making a short speech, said, "Is the man of Tyana living here?" "Yes," they replied, "and he has much improved us thereby." "Can he then be induced to give us an interview?" said the emperor, "for I am very much in want of him." "He will meet you," said Dion, "in the temple, for he admitted as much to me when I was on my way here." "Let us go on," said the king, "at once, to offer our prayers to the gods, and to meet so noble a man." This is how the story grew up, that it was during his conduct of the siege of Jerusalem that the idea of making himself emperor suggested itself to him, and that he sent for Apollonius to ask his advice on the point, but that the latter declined to enter a country which its inhabitants polluted both by what they did and by what they suffered, which was the reason why Vespasian came in person to Egypt, as well because he now had possession of the throne as in order to hold with our sage the conversations which I shall relate. Chapter 28. For after he had sacrificed, and before he gave official audiences to the cities, he addressed himself to Apollonius, and as if making prayer, he said to him, "Do you make me king?" And he answered, "I have done so already, for I have already offered a prayer for a king who should be just and noble and temperate, endowed with the wisdom of gray hairs, and the father of legitimate sons. And surely in my prayer I was asking from the gods for none other but thyself." The emperor was delighted with this answer, for the crowd too in the temple shouted their agreement with it. "What then?" said the emperor. "Did you think of the reign of Nero?" And Apollonius answered, "Nero perhaps understood how to tune a lyre, but he disgraced the empire both by letting the strings go too slack and by drawing them too tight." "Then," said the other, "you would like a ruler to observe the mean?" "Not I," said Apollonius, "but God himself, who has deigned equality as consisting in the mean. And these gentlemen here, they too are good advisers in this matter," he added, pointing to Dion and Euphrates, for the latter had not yet quarreled with him. Thereupon the king held up his hand and said, "O Zeus, may I hold sway over wise men, and wise men hold sway over me." And turning himself round towards the Egyptians, he said, "You shall draw as liberally upon me as you do upon the Nile." Chapter 29. The result, then, was that the Egyptians regained their prosperity, for they were already exhausted by the oppressions they suffered. But as he went down from the temple, he grasped the hand of Apollonius, and taking him with him into the palace, said, "Perhaps some will think me young and foolish, because I assume the reins of kingship in the 60th year of my life. I will then communicate to you my reasons for doing so, in order that you may justify my actions to others, for I was never the slave of wealth that I know of, even in my youth. and in the matter of the magistracies and the honors and the gift of the Roman sovereign, I bore myself with so much soberness and moderation as to avoid being thought either overbearing or, on the other hand, craven and cowardly. Nor did I cherish any but loyal feelings towards Nero, but inasmuch as he had received the crown, if not in strict accordance with the law, at any rate from the autocrat, I submitted to him for the sake of Claudius, who made me consul and sharer of his counsels. And by Athene, I never saw Nero demeaning himself without shedding tears, when I thought of Claudius and contrasted with him the wretch who had inherited the greatest of his possessions. And now when I see that even the disappearance of the scene of Nero has brought no change for the better in the fortunes of humanity, and that the throne has fallen to such dishonor as to be assigned to Vitellius, I boldly advance to take it myself. Firstly, because I wish to endear myself to men and win their esteem, and secondly, because the man I have to contend with is a mere drunkard. For Vitellius uses more ointment in his bath than I do water, and I believe that if you ran a sword into him, more ointment would issue from the wound than blood, and his continuous bouts of drinking have made him mad, and one who, were he dying, would be full of apprehension lest the pieces should play him false, is yet hazarding the empire in play. And though he is the slave of mistresses, he nevertheless insults married women, and says that he likes to spice his amours with a little danger. His worst excesses I will not mention, for I would rather not allude to such matters in your presence. May I then never submit tamely while the Romans are ruled by such a man as he. Let me rather ask the gods to guide me so that I may be true to myself. And this, Apollonius, is why I, as it were, make fast my cable to yourself. For they say that you have the amplest insight into the will of the gods, and why I ask you to share with me in my anxieties and aid me in plans on which rest the safety of sea and land, to the end that, supposing the good will of heaven show itself on my side, I may fulfill my task. But if heaven opposes and favors neither myself nor the Romans, that I may not trouble the gods against their wills. Chapter 30. Apollonius clinched his words with an appeal to heaven. O Zeus, said he, of the Capitol, for thou art he whom I know to be the arbiter or the present of issue, do thou preserve thyself for this man, and this man for thyself. For this man who stands before thee is destined to raise afresh unto thee the temple which only yesterday the hands of malefactors set on fire. And on the emperor expressing astonishment at his words, the facts themselves, he said, you will reveal. So do thou ask nothing of me, but continue and complete that which thou hast so rightly purposed. Now it happened just then, as a matter of fact, that in Rome Diomitian, the son of Vespasian, was matched with Vitellius in the struggle to gain the empire for his father, and was besieged in the Capitol, with the result that although he escaped the fury of the besiegers, the temple was burnt down. And all this was revealed to Apollonius more quickly than if it had taken place in Egypt. When they had held their conversation, he left the emperor's presence, saying that it was not permitted him by the religion of the Indians to proceed at midday in any way other than the Indians do themselves. At the same time the emperor brightened up, and with fresh enthusiasm, instead of allowing matters to slip through his hands, persevered in his policy, convinced by Apollonius's words that his future was stable and assured to him by heaven. Chapter 31. Next day at dawn Apollonius came to the palace and asked the guards what the emperor was doing, from whom learning that he had long risen and was engaged in his correspondence, he went off and remarked to Damis, "This man shall be sovereign." About sunrise he returned to find Dion and Euphrates already at the door, in return to whose eager inquiries concerning the interview he repeated the defense of his policy which he had heard from the emperor, though at the same time he let no word escape him of his own opinions. But on being summoned to enter in advance of them, he said, "O king, Euphrates and Dion, long your acquaintances, are at your door, being highly anxious for your welfare. I pray you, call them in also to join in our conversation, for they are both of them wise men. I throw my doors open, he replied, to wise men, but to you I purpose to open my breast as well. Chapter 32. When they had been called in, he continued, In defense of my plans, I said, gentlemen, what I had to say yesterday to Apollonius, our esteemed friend. We have heard that defense, said Dion, and it was most reasonable. Well, today, he went on, my dear Dion, let us concert some wise conclusions in support of the counsels adopted by me, of a kind to ensure my general policy being both honorable and salutary to mankind. For I cannot forget how Tiberius was the first to degrade the government into an inhuman and cruel system, of how he was followed by Gaius, who, filled with Bacchic frenzy, dressed in Lydian fashion, won sham fights, and by his disgraceful revels violated all Roman institutions. There followed the worthy Claudius, and I remember that he was so much the thrall of women as to lose all sense of sovereignty, nay, even of self-preservation, for they say he was murdered by them. Nero I hardly need assail, for Apollonius, in brief and terse remarks, has exposed the faults of overindulgence and undue severity by which he disgraced his reign. Nor did I dwell on the system of Galba, who was slain in the middle of the forum in the act of adopting those strumpet sons of his Otho and Piso. As for Vitellius, we had rather Nero should come to life again than betray the empire to him, the most dissolute of all. Perceiving then, my friends, that the throne has fallen into hatred and contempt by reason of the tyrants I have enumerated, I would fain have you advise me how best I can restore it, so that it should not remain what it has become, namely a stumbling block to mankind. Apollonius replied as follows. There was a first-rate flute-player, it is said, who used to send his pupils to much worse artists than himself, that they might learn how not to pipe. As then you, my sovereign, have learned from these your good-for-nothing predecessors how not to rule, let us then now turn our attention to the problem, how a sovereign ought to rule. Chapter 33. While Apollonius spoke, Euphrates concealed the jealousy he already felt of one whose utterances clearly interested the emperor hardly less than those of an oracular shrine interest those who repair to it for guidance. But now at last his feelings overcame him. Raising his voice above its usual pitch, he cried, We must not flatter men's impulses, nor allow ourselves to be carried away against our better judgment by men of unbridled ambition. But we should rather, if we are enamored of wisdom, recall them to the rhythm of life. Here is a policy about the very expediency of which we should first calmly deliberate, and yet you would have us prescribe a way of executing it before you know if the measures under discussion are desirable. For myself, I quite approve of the deposition of Vitellius, whom I know to be a ruffian drunk, with every sort of profligacy. Nevertheless, although I know you to be a worthy man and of preeminent nobility of character, I deny that you ought to undertake the correction of Vitellius without first establishing an ideal for yourself. I need not instruct you in the excesses chargeable to monarchy as such, for you have yourself described them. But this I would have you recognize, that whereas youth leaping into the tyrant's saddle does but obey its own instincts, for playing the tyrant comes as natural to young men as wine or women, and we cannot reproach a young man merely for making himself a tyrant, unless in pursuit of his role he shows himself a murderer, a ruffian, and a debauchee. On the other hand, when an old man makes himself a tyrant, the first thing we blame in him is that he ever nursed such an ambition. It is no use his showing himself an example of humanity and moderation. For of these qualities we shall give the credit not to himself, but to his age and mature training. And men will believe that he nursed the ambition long before, when he was still a stripling, only that he failed to realize it, and such failures are attributed partly to ill luck, partly to pusillanimity. I mean that he will be thought to have renounced his dream of becoming a tyrant because he distrusted his own star, or that he stood aside and made way for another who entertained the same ambition and whose superior courage he dreaded. As for the count of ill luck, I may dismiss it. But as for that of cowardice, how could you avoid it? How escape the reproach of having been afraid of Nero, the most cowardly and supine of rulers? Look at the revolt against him planned by Vindex. You surely were the man of the hour, its natural leader, and not he. For you had an army at your back, and the forces you were leading against the Jews, would they not have been more suitably employed in chastising Nero? For the Jews have long been in revolt, not only against the Romans, but against humanity. And a race that has made its own a life apart and irreconcilable, that cannot share with the rest of mankind in the pleasures of the table, nor join in their libations or prayers or sacrifices, are separated from ourselves by a greater gulf than divides us from Susa or Bactra or the most distant Indies. What sense then or reason was there in chastising them for revolting from us, whom we had better have never annexed? As for Nero, who would not have prayed with his own hand to slay a man well nigh drunk with human blood, singing as he sat amidst the hecatombs of his victims? I confess that I ever pricked up my ears when any messenger from yonder brought tidings of yourself, and told us how in one battle you had slain 30,000 Jews, and in the next 50,000. In such cases, I would take the courier aside and quietly ask him, "But what of the great man? Will he not rise to higher things than this?" Since then you have discovered in Vitellius an image and ape of Nero, and are turning your arms against him. Persist in the policy you have embraced, for it too is a noble one, only let its sequel be noble too. You know how dear to Romans are popular institutions, and how nearly all their conquests were won under a free polity. Put then an end to monarchy, of which you have repeated to us so evil a record, and bestow upon Romans a popular government, and on yourself the glory of inaugurating for them a reign of liberty. Chapter 34. Throughout Euphrates' long speech, Apollonius noticed that Dion shared his sentiments, for he manifested his approval both by gestures and the applause with which he hailed his words. So he asked him if he could not add some remarks of his own to what he had just heard. "By heaven I can," answered Dion, "and I should agree in part and in part disagree with his remarks. For I think I have myself told you that he would have been much better employed deposing Nero than setting Jewry to right. But your contention appears to be that he ought never to have been deposed, on the ground that anyone who composed the disorder of his affairs merely strengthened the fellow against all the victims of his power. I approve, however, of the campaign against Vitellius, for I consider it a great achievement to prevent a tyranny from ever growing up than to put an end to it when it is established. And while I welcome the idea of a democracy, for though this form of polity is inferior to aristocracy, nevertheless moderate men will prefer it to tyrannies and oligarchies. I fear lest the servility to which these successive tyrannies have reduced the Romans will render any change difficult to effect. I doubt if they are able to comport themselves as free men, or even to lift their eyes to a democracy, any more than people who have been kept in the dark are able to look on sudden blaze of light. I conclude that Vitellius ought to be driven from power, and would fain see this effected as quickly and as well as can be. I think, however, that though you should be prepared for war, yet you yourself, instead of declaring war against him, ought rather to threaten him with condign punishment, in case he refuses to abdicate. And in case you capture him, as I believe you will easily do, then I would fain see you give the people of Rome the right to choose their own polity, and if they choose a democracy, allow it them. For this will bring you greater glory than many tyrannies and many victories at Olympia. Your name will be inscribed all over the city, and brazen statues will be erected everywhere, and you will furnish us with a theme for harangues in which neither Harmodius nor Aristogeiton will bear comparison with you. If, however, they accept monarchy, to whom can they all possibly decree the throne except yourself? For what you already possess and are about to resign into the hands of the public, they will surely rather confer on yourself than on another. This is the end of chapters 25 through 34 of Volume 1, Book 5 of the Life of Apollonius of Tyana, read by Mary Schneider.
Volume 1, Book 5, chapters 35 through 43 of the Life of Apollonius of Tyana. The Life of Apollonius of Tyana by Flavius Philostratus, translated by F.C. Conybeare. Volume 1, Book 5. Chapter 35. There followed a spell of silence, during which the emperor's countenance betrayed contending emotions. For though he was an absolute ruler both in title and in fact, it looked as if they were trying to divert him from his resolution to remain such, and accordingly Apollonius remarked, "It seems to me you are mistaken in trying to cancel a monarchical policy when it is already a foregone conclusion, and that you indulge a garrulity as childish as it is in such a crisis idle. Were it I that had stepped into such a position of influence as he has, and were I, when taking counsel about what good I could do to the world, treated to such advice as you now give, your arguments would carry some force, for philosophic aphorisms might amend the philosophically minded of your listeners. But as it is a consul and a man accustomed to rule, whom you pretend to advise, one moreover, over whom ruin impends, if he fall from power, need we carp, if instead of rejecting the gifts of fortune, he welcomes them when they come, and only deliberates how to make a discreet use of what is his own? Let us take a similar case. Suppose we saw an athlete, well endowed with courage and stature, and by his well-knit frame marked out as a winner in the Olympic contest. Suppose we approached him when he was already on his way thither through Arcadia, and while encouraging him to face his rivals, yet insisted that, in the event of his winning the prize, he must not allow himself to be proclaimed the victor, nor consent to wear the wreath of wild olive. Should we not be set down as imbeciles mocking at one another's labors? Similarly, when we regard the eminent man before us, and think of the enormous army at his disposal, of the glint of their brazen arms, of his clouds of cavalry, of his own personal qualities, of his generosity, self-restraint, of his fitness to attain his objects, ought we not to send him forward on the path that leads to his goal, with favoring encouragement and with more auspicious pledges for his future than these you have recorded? For there is another thing that you have forgotten, that he is the father of 2 sons, who are already in command of armies, and whose deepest enmity he will incur if he does not bequeath the empire to them. Is he not confronted by the alternative of embroiling himself in hostilities with his own family? If, however, he accepts the throne, he will have the devoted service of his own children. They will lean on him and he on them, using them as his bodyguard, and by his use, as a bodyguard not hired by money, nor levied by force, nor feigning loyalty with their faces only, but attached to him by bonds of natural instinct and true affection. For myself, I care little about constitutions, seeing that my life is governed by the gods, but I do not like to see the human flock perish for want of a shepherd at once just and moderate. For just a single man preeminent in virtue transforms a democracy into the guise of a government of a single man who is the best. So the government of one man, if it provides all around for the welfare of the community, is popular government. You did not, we are told, help to depose Nero. And did you, Euphrates, or you, Dion? Did I myself? However, no one finds fault with us for that, nor regards us as cowardly because, after philosophers have destroyed 1,000 tyrannies, we have missed the glory of striking a blow for liberty. Not but that, as regards myself, I did take the field against Nero, and in response to several malignant accusations, assailed his cutthroat Tigellinus to his face, and the aid I rendered to Vindex in the western half of the empire was, I hardly need say, in the nature of a redoubt raised against Nero. But I should not on that account claim for myself the honor of having pulled down that tyrant, any more than I should regard yourselves as falling short of the philosopher's ideal of courage and constancy, because you did nothing of the sort. For a man, then, of philosophic habit, it is enough that he should say what he really thinks. But he will, I imagine, take care not to talk like a fool or a madman. For a council, on the other hand, who designs to depose a tyrant, the first requisite is plenty of deliberation, with a view to conceal his plans till they are ripe for action. And the second is a suitable pretense, to save him from the reproach of breaking his oath. For before he dreams of resorting to arms against the man who appointed him general, and whose welfare he swore to safeguard in the council chamber and on the field, he must surely, in self-defense, furnish heaven with proof that he perjures himself in the cause of religion. He will also need many friends, if he is not to approach the enterprise unfenced and unfortified, and also all the money he can get, so as to be able to win over the men in power, the more so as he attacks a man who commands the resources of the entire earth. All this demands no end of care, no end of time, and you may take all this as you like, for we are not called upon to sit in judgment on ambitions which he may possibly have entertained, but in which fortune refused to second him, even when he came to fight for them. What answer, however, will you make to the following proposition? Here is one who yesterday assumed the throne, who accepted the crown offered by the cities here in the temples around us, whose rescripts are as brilliant as they are ungrudging. Do you bid him issue a proclamation today to the effect that for the future he retires into private life, and only assumed the reins of government in an access of madness? As, if he carries through the policy on which he is resolved, he will confirm the loyalty of the guards relying on whom he first entertained it, so, if he falters and departs from it, he will find an enemy in everyone whom from that moment he must mistrust. Chapter 36. The emperor listened gladly to the above, and remarked, "If you were the tenant of my breast, you could not more accurately report my inmost thoughts. 'Tis yourself, then, I will follow, for every word which falls from your lips I regard as inspired. Therefore instruct me, I pray, in all the duties of a good king." Apollonius answered, "You ask of me a lore which cannot be imparted by any teacher, for kingship is at once the greatest of human attainments, and not to be taught. However, I will mention you all the things which, if you do them, you will, in my opinion, do wisely. Look not on that which is laid by as wealth, for how is it better than so much sand drifted no matter from whence, nor on what flows into your coffers from populations racked by the tax-gatherer, for gold lacks luster and is mere dross if it be wrung from men's tears. If you make better use of your wealth than your sovereign did, if you employ it in succouring the poor, at the same time that you render your wealth secure for the rich, tremble before the very absoluteness of your prerogative, for so you will exercise it with the greater moderation. Mow not down the loftier stocks which overtop the rest, for this maxim of Aristotle's is unjust. But try rather to pluck dissatisfaction out of men's hearts, as you would tares out of the cornfields, and inspire awe of yourself in revolutionists less by actual punishment than by showing them that they will not go unpunished. Let the law govern you as well as them, O king, for you will be all the wiser as a legislator for so holding the laws in respect. Reverence the gods more than ever before, for you have received great blessings at their hands, and have still great ones to pray for. In what appertains to your prerogative, act as a sovereign. In what to your own person, as a private citizen. About dice and drink and dissipation, and the necessity of abhorring these vices, why need I tender you any advice? Who, they say, never approved of them even in youth? You have, my sovereign, 2 sons, both, they say, of generous disposition. Let them before all obey your authority, for your faults will be charged to your account. Let your disciplining of them even proceed to the length of threatening not to bequeath them your throne, unless they remain good men and honest. Otherwise, they will be prone to regard it not as a reward of excellence, so much as a mere heritage. As for the pleasures which have made of Rome their home and residence, and they are many, I would advise you, my sovereign, to use much discretion in suppressing them. For it is not easy to convert an entire people on a sudden to a wisdom and temperance. But you must feel your way, and instill order and rhythm in their characters, step by step, partly by open, partly by secret correction. Let us put an end to pride and luxury on the part of the freedmen and slaves, whom your high position assigns to you, by accustoming them to think all the more humbly of themselves, because their master is so powerful. There remains only one topic to address you on. It concerns the governors sent out to rule the provinces. Of those you will yourself select, I need say nothing, for I am sure you will assign commands by merit. I only refer to those who will acquire them by lot. In their case, too, I maintain, those only should be sent out to the various provinces so obtained who are in sympathy, so far as the symptom of appointing by lot allows of it, with the populations they will rule. I mean that over Hellenes should be set men who can speak Greek, and Romans over those who can speak that language or dialects allied to it. I will tell you what made me think of this. During the period in which I lived in the Peloponnese Hellas, was governed by a man who knew as little of the Hellenists and their affairs as they understood of his. What was the result? He was in his mistakes as much sinned against as sinner, for his assessors, and those who shared with him judicial authority, trafficked in justice, and abused his authority, as if he had been not their governor, but their slave. This, my sovereign, is all that occurs to me today. But if anything else should come into my mind, we can hold another interview. So now, apply yourself to the duties of your throne, lest your subjects accuse you of indolence. Chapter 37. Euphrates declared his assent to all these conclusions. For, said he, what can I gain by continuing to oppose such teaching? But, O my sovereign, I have only one thing left to say, and that is that while you approve and countenance that philosophy which accords with nature, you should have nothing to do with that which affects a secret intercourse with the gods. For we are easily puffed up by the many absurdities this lying philosophy falsely ascribes to Providence. The above remark was aimed at Apollonius, who, however, without paying any attention to it, departed with his companions as soon as he had ended his discourse, and Euphrates would have taken further liberties with his character, only the emperor noticed it, and put him aside by saying, Call in those who have business with the government, and let my council resume its usual form. Thus, Euphrates failed to see that he only prejudiced himself, and gained with the emperor the reputation of being a jealous and insolent fellow, who aired these sentiments in favor of democracy, not because he really entertained them, but only by way of contradicting the opinions of Apollonius, held in regard to the empire. Notwithstanding, the emperor did not cast him off, or show any resentment at his opinions. As for Dion, he did not cease to be fond of him, though he regarded his seconding the opinions of Euphrates. For Dion was a delightful conversationalist, and always declined to quarrel. He, moreover, imparted to his discourses that sort of charm which exhales from the perfumes at a sacrifice, and he had also, better than any living man, the talent to extempore oratory. Apollonius the emperor not merely loved for his own sake, but was ever ready to listen to his accounts of antiquity, to his descriptions of the Indian Phraotes, and to his graphic stories of the rivers of India and of the animals that inhabit it; above all, to the forecasts and revelations imparted to him by the gods concerning the future of the empire. On quitting Egypt, after settling and rejuvenating the country, he invited Apollonius to share his voyage, but after the latter declined, on the ground that he had not yet seen the whole extent of Egypt, and had not yet visited or conversed with the naked sages of that land, whose wisdom he was very anxious to compare with that of India. Nor, he added, have I drunk of the sources of the Nile. The emperor understood that he was about to set out for Ethiopia, and said, "Will you not bear me in mind?" "I will indeed," replied the sage, "if you continue to be a good sovereign and mindful of yourself." Chapter 38. Thereafter the emperor offered his sacrifices in the temple, and publicly promised him presents. But Apollonius, as if he had a favor to ask, said, "And what presents, O king, will you give me?" He replied, 10 now, and when you have come to Rome, everything I have." And Apollonius answered, "Then I must husband your riches, as if they were my own, and not squander in the present what is hereafter to be reserved to me in its entirety. But I pray you, O king, to attend rather to these gentlemen here, for they look as if they wanted something." And suiting his words, he pointed to Euphrates and his friends. The emperor accordingly pressed them to ask boldly what they desired, whereupon Dion with a blush said, "Reconcile me, O king, with Apollonius my teacher, for that I lately ventured to oppose him in argument, for never till now have I ventured to contradict him." The emperor, approving, said, "As long ago as yesterday I asked for this favor, and it is already granted. But do you ask for some gift?" "Lasthenes," replied Dion, "of Apamia, a Bithynian city, who was my companion in philosophy, fell in love with a uniform, and took to a soldier's life. Now, he says, he longs afresh to wear the sage's cloak, so would you let him off for the service, for that is the extent of his own request, and you will confer on me the privilege of turning him into a saint, and on him the liberty of living as he wishes to." "Let him be released," said the emperor, "but I confer on him the rights of a veteran, since he is equally fond of wisdom and of yourself." Next, the emperor turned to Euphrates, who had drawn up a letter embodying his requests, and held it out in expectation that his sovereign would peruse it in private. But the latter was determined to expose him to criticism, so he read it out loud before everyone. It was found to contain various petitions, some for himself, some for others, and of the presents asked, some consisted of cash down, and others of credit notes. Whereupon Apollonius with a laugh remarked, "Then your intention of asking a monarch for all this did not prevent you from giving him that good advice in favor of democracy?" Chapter 39. Such, I find, was the occasion of the quarrel between Apollonius and Euphrates, and after the emperor had departed, they openly attacked one another, Euphrates in his anger resorting to coarse insults, which his antagonist met in a philosophical spirit, only refuting him. His accusations, I may remark, of Euphrates to the effect that his conduct violated the decencies of the philosophical life can be learned from the epistles Apollonius addressed to him, for they are not a few. For myself, I herewith dismiss this gentleman, for it is no part of my scheme to say ill of him, but only to furnish with a life of Apollonius those who are as yet ignorant. As to the tale of the stick, which he is said to have brandished against Apollonius when he was discoursing, though without applying it, most people attribute his having so refrained from the commanding dignity of the man he was about to strike. But I prefer to set it down to the good sense of the would-be striker, and to think that it was that which enabled him to overcome an angry impulse which had all but overmastered him. Chapter 40. Dion's philosophy struck Apollonius as being too rhetorical, and overmuch adapted to please and flatter, and that is why he addressed to him by way of correction the words, "You should use a pipe and a lyre if you want to tickle men's senses, and not speech." And in many passages of his letters to Dion, he censures his use of words to captivate the crowd. Chapter 41. I must also explain how it came about that he never approached the emperor again, nor visited him after their encounter in Egypt, although the latter invited him and wrote often to him in that sense. The fact is, Nero restored the liberties of Hellas with a wisdom and moderation quite alien to his character, and the cities regained their Doric and Attic characteristics, and a general rejuvenescence accompanied the institution among them of a peace and harmony such as not even ancient Hellas ever enjoyed. Vespasian, however, on his arrival in the country, took away her liberty, alleging their factiousness, and other pretexts hardly justifying such extreme severity. This policy seemed not only to those who suffered by it, but to Apollonius as well, of a harshness quite out of keeping with a royal temper and character, and accordingly he addressed the following letters to the emperor. Apollonius to the Emperor Vespasian. Greeting. You have, they say, enslaved Hellas, and you imagine you have excelled Xerxes. You are mistaken. You have only fallen below Nero, for the latter held our liberties in his hand and respected them. Farewell. To the same. You have taken such a dislike to the Hellenists that you have enslaved them, although they were free. What then do you want with my company? Farewell. To the same. Nero freed the Hellenists in play, but you have enslaved them in all seriousness. Farewell. Such were the grounds of Apollonius taking a dislike to Vespasian. However, when he heard of the excellence of his subsequent acts of government, he made no attempt to conceal his satisfaction, but looked at it in the light of a benefaction conferred on himself. Chapter 42. The following incident also of Apollonius's stay in Egypt was thought remarkable. There was a man led a tame lion about by a string, as if it had been a dog, and the animal not only fawned upon him, but on anyone who approached it. It went collecting alms all round the towns, and was admitted even in the temples, being a pure animal, for it never licked up the blood of the victims, nor pounced upon them when they were being flayed and cut up, but lived upon honey cakes and bread, and dried fruits and cooked meats. And you also came on it drinking wine without changing its character. One day it came up to Apollonius when he was sitting in the temples, and whined and fawned at his knees, and begged of him more earnestly than it had ever done of anybody. The bystanders imagined it wanted some solid reward, but Apollonius exclaimed, "This lion is begging me to make you understand that a human soul is within him, the soul, namely, of Immerses, the king of Egypt in the province of Sais." And when the lion heard that, he gave a piteous and plaintive roar, and crouching down, began to lament, shedding tears. Thereupon Apollonius stroked him, and said, "I think the lion ought to be sent to Leontopolis, and dedicated to the temple there. For I consider it wrong that a king who has been changed into the most kingly of beasts should go about begging like any human mendicant." In consequence, the priests met and offered sacrifice to Amasis, and having decorated the animal with a collar and ribbons, they conveyed him up country into Egypt with pipings, hymns, and songs composed in his honor. Chapter 43. Having had enough of Alexandria, the sage set out for Egypt and Ethiopia to visit the naked sages. Menippus, then, as he was by now a qualified disputant and remarkably outspoken, he left behind to watch Euphrates, and perceiving that Dioscorides had not a strong enough constitution for foreign travel, he dissuaded him from undertaking the journey. The rest of the company he mustered, for though some had left him in Aricia, many others had subsequently joined him, and he explained to them about his impending journey, and began as follows. "I must needs preface in Olympic wise my address to you, my brave friends, and the following is an Olympic exordium. When the Olympic games are coming on, the people of Els train the athletes for 30 days in their own country. Likewise, when the Pythian games approach, the natives of Delphi. And when the Isthmian, the Corinthians assemble and say, 'Go now into the arena, and prove yourselves men worthy of victory.' The Eleans, however, on their way to Olympia, address the athletes thus: 'If you have labored so hard as to be entitled to go to Olympia, and have banished all sloth and cowardice from your lives, then march boldly on. But as for those who have not so trained themselves, let them depart whithersoever they like.' The companions of the sage understood his meaning, and about 20 of them remained with Menippus. But the rest, 10 in number, I believe, offered prayer to the gods, and having sacrificed such an offering as men offer when they embark for a voyage, they departed straight for the pyramids, mounted on camels, and keeping the Nile on their right hand. In several places they took boats across the river in order to visit every site on it, for there was not a city, fane, or sacred site in Egypt that they passed by without discussion. For at each they either learned or taught some holy story, so that any ship on which Apollonius embarked resembled the sacred galley of a religious legation. End of Book 5, chapters 35 through 43. End of Volume 1. Volume 2, Book 6, chapters 1 through 10 of the Life of Apollonius of Tyana. The Life of Apollonius of Tyana by Flavius Philostratus, translated by F.C. Conybeare. Volume 2, Book 6. Chapter 1. Ethiopia covers the western ring of the entire earth under the sun, just as India does the eastern wing, and at Menro it adjoins Egypt, and after skirting a part of Libya incognita, it ends at the sea, which the poets call by the name of the ocean, that being the name they applied to the mass of water which surrounds the earth. This country supplies Egypt with the river Nile, which takes its rise at the cataracts, and brings down from Ethiopia all Egypt, the soil of which in flood time it inundates. Now in size, this country is not worthy of comparison with India, nor for that matter is any other one of the continents that are famous among men. And even if you put together all Egypt with Ethiopia, and we may regard the river as so combining the two, we could not compare the two together with India, so vast is the standard of comparison. However, their respective rivers, the Indus and the Nile, resemble one another, if we consider their natures. For they both spread their moisture over the land in the summer season, when the earth most wants it, and unlike all other rivers, they produce the crocodile and the river horse, and the religious rites celebrated over them correspond with one another, for many of the religious invocations of the Indians are repeated in the case of the Nile. We have a proof of the similarity of the two countries in the spices which are found in them, also in the fact that the lion and the elephant are captured and confined in both the one and the other. They are also the haunts of animals not found elsewhere, and of black men, a feature not found in other continents, and we meet in them with races of pygmies and of people who bark in various ways instead of talking, and other wonders of the kind. And the griffins of the Indians, and the ants of the Ethiopians, though they are dissimilar in form, yet, from what we hear, play similar parts, for in each country they are, according to the tales of poets, the guardians of gold, and devoted to the gold reefs of the two countries. But we will not pursue this subject, for we must resume the course of our history and follow in the sage's footsteps. Chapter 2. For when he arrived at the confines of Ethiopia and Egypt, and the name of the place is Sycaminus, he came across a quantity of uncoined gold, and linen, and an elephant, and various roots, and myrrh, and spices, which were all lying without any one to watch them at the crossways. I will explain the meaning of this, for the same custom still survives among ourselves. It was a marketplace to which the Ethiopians bring all the products of their country, and the Egyptians, in their turn, take them all away, and bring to the same spot their own wares of equal value, so bartering what they have got for what they have not. Now the inhabitants of the marches are not yet fully black, but are half-breeds in matter of color, for they are partly not so black as the Ethiopians, yet partly more so than the Egyptians. Apollonius, accordingly, when he realized the character of the market, remarked, "Contrast our good Hellenes. They pretend they cannot live unless one penny begets another, and unless they can force up the price of their goods by chaffering or holding back. And one pretends that he has got a daughter whom it is time to marry, and another that he has got a son who has just reached manhood, and a third that he has to pay his subscription to his club, and a fourth that he is having a house built for him, and a fifth that he would be ashamed of being a worse man of business than his father was before him. What a splendid thing it would be if wealth were held in less honor, and equality flourished a little more, and if the black iron were left to rust in the ground, for then all men would agree with one another, and the whole earth would be like one brotherhood." Chapter 3. With such conversations, the occasions providing as usual the topics he talked about, he turned his steps towards Memnon. An Egyptian boy showed them the way, of whom Damis gives the following account. Timasion was the name of this stripling, who was just emerging from boyhood, and was now in the prime of life and strength. He had a stepmother who had fallen in love with him, and when he rejected her overtures, she set upon him, and by way of spiting him, had poisoned his father's mind against him, condescending to a lower intrigue than ever Phaedra had done, for she accused him of being effeminate, and of finding his pleasure in favorites rather than in women. He had accordingly abandoned Naucratis, for it was there that all this happened, and was living in the neighborhood of Memphis, and he had acquired and manned a boat of his own, and was plying as a waterman on the Nile. He then was going down the river when he saw Apollonius sailing up it, and he concluded that the crew consisted of wise men, because he judged them by the cloaks they wore, and the books they were hard at work studying. So he asked them whether they would allow one who was so passionately fond of wisdom as himself to share their voyage, and Apollonius said, "This youth is wise, my friends, so let him be granted his request." And he further related the story about the stepmother to those of his companions who were nearest to him, in a low tone while the stripling was still sailing towards them. But when the ships were alongside of one another, Timasion stepped out of his boat, and after addressing a word or two to his pilot about the cargo in his own boat, he greeted the company. Apollonius then ordered him to sit down under his eyes, and said, You, stripling of Egypt, for you seem to be one of the natives, tell me what you have done of evil or what of good, for in the one case you shall be forgiven by me, in consideration of your youth, but in the other you shall reap my condemnation, and become a fellow student of philosophy with me and with these gentlemen. Then, noticing that Timasion blushed and checked his impulse to speak, and hesitated whether to say or not what he had been going to say, he pressed his question and repeated it, just as if he had no foreknowledge of the youth at his command. Then Timasion plucked up courage and said, O heavens, how shall I describe myself? For I am not a bad boy, and yet I do not know whether I ought to be considered a good one, for there is no particular merit in having abstained from wrong. But Apollonius cried, Bravo, my boy! You answer me just as if you were a sage from India, for this was just the sentiment of the divine Iarchus. But tell me how you came to form these opinions, and how long ago, for it strikes me that you have been on your guard against some sin. The youth then began to tell them of his stepmother's infatuation for himself, and of how he had rejected her advances, and when he did so, there was a shout in recognition of the divine inspiration under which Apollonius had foretold these details. Timasion, however, caught them up and said, Most excellent people, what is the matter with you? For my story is one which calls as little for your admiration, I think, as for your ridicule. But Damis said, It was not that we were admiring, but something else which you don't know about yet. As for you, my boy, we praise you because you do not think you did anything very remarkable. And Apollonius asked, Do you sacrifice to Aphrodite, my boy? And Timasion answered, Yes, by Zeus, every day, for I consider that this goddess has great influence in human and divine affairs. Therefore Apollonius was delighted beyond measure, and cried, Let us, gentlemen, vote a crown to him for his continence, rather than to Hippolytus, the son of Theseus, for the latter insulted Aphrodite, and that perhaps is why he never fell a victim to the tender passion, and why love never ran riot in his soul. But he was allotted an austere and unbending nature. But our friend here admits that he is devoted to the goddess, and yet did not respond to his stepmother's guilty overtures, but went away in terror of the goddess herself, in case he were not on his guard against another's evil passions. And the mere aversion to any one of the gods, such as Hippolytus, entertained in regard to Aphrodite, I do not class as a form of sobriety, for it is a much greater proof of wisdom and sobriety to speak well of all the gods, especially at Athens, where altars are set up in honor even of unknown gods. So great was the interest which he took in Timasion. Nevertheless, he called him Hippolytus, for the eyes with which he looked at his stepmother. It seemed also that he was a young man who was particular about his person, and enhanced its charms by attention to athletic exercises. Chapter 4. Under his guidance, they say, they went on to the sacred enclosure of Memnon, of whom Damis gives the following account. He says that he was the son of the dawn, and that he did not meet his death in Troy, where indeed he never went, but that he died in Ethiopia after ruling the land for 5 generations. But his countrymen, being the longest lived of men, still mourn him as a mere youth, and deplore his untimely death. But the place in which his statue is set up resembles, they tell us, an ancient marketplace, such as remain in cities that were long ago inhabited, and where we come on the remains of columns delicately worked, and find traces of walls, and of seats, and of the jambs of doors, and images of Hermes, some destroyed by the hand of men, others by that of time. Now this statue, says Damis, was turned towards the sunrise, and was that of a youth still unbearded, and it was made of a black stone, and the 2 feet were joined together after the style in which statues were made in the time of Daedalus, and the hands were thrust down, supporting the body upright upon its seat. For though the figure was still sitting up, it was represented in the very act and impulse of rising up. We hear much of this attitude of the statue, and of the expression of its eyes, and of how the lips seem about to speak, but they say that they had no opportunity of admiring these effects until they saw them realized. For when the sun's rays fell upon the statue, and this happened exactly at dawn, they could not restrain their admiration, for the lips spoke immediately, the sun's rays touched them, and the eyes seemed to stand out and gleam against the light, as do those of men who love to bask in the sun. Then they say they understood that the figure was of one in the act of rising, and making obeisance to the sun, in the way those do who worship the powers above, standing erect. They accordingly offered a sacrifice to the sun of Ethiopia, and to Memnon of the dawn. For this the priests recommended them to do, explaining that the one name was derived from the words signifying to burn and be warm, and the other from his mother. Having done this, they set out upon camels for the home of the naked philosophers. Chapter 5. On the way, they met a man wearing the garb of the inhabitants of Memphis, but who was wandering about, rather than wending his steps to a fixed point. So Damis asked him who he was, and why he was roving about like that. But Timasion said, "You had better ask me, and not him, for he will never tell you what is the matter with him, because he is ashamed of the plight in which he finds himself. But as for me, I know the poor man, and pity him, and I will tell you all about him. For he has slain unwittingly a certain inhabitant of Memphis, and the laws of Memphis prescribe that a person exiled for an involuntary offense of this kind, and the penalty is exile, should remain with the naked philosophers until he has washed away the guilt of bloodshed, and then he may return home as soon as he is pure, though he must first go to the tomb of the slain man and sacrifice there some trifling victim. Until now he has been received by the naked philosophers. So long he must roam about these marches, until they take pity upon him as if he were a suppliant." Apollonius therefore put the question to Timasion, "What do the naked philosophers think of this particular exile?" And he answered, "I do not know anything more than that this is the 7th month that he has remained here as a suppliant, and that he has not yet obtained redemption." Said Apollonius, "You don't call men wise who refused to purify him, and they are not aware that Philiscus, whom he slew, was a descendant of Thamus, the Egyptian, who long ago laid waste the country of these naked philosophers." Thereat Timasion said in surprise, "What do you mean?" "I mean," said the other, "my good youth, that was actually the fact. For this Thamus, once on a time, was intriguing against the inhabitants of Memphis, and these philosophers detected his plot and prevented him. And he, having failed in his enterprise, retaliated by laying waste all the land upon which they live, for by his brigandage he tyrannized the country round Memphis. I perceive that Philiscus, whom this man slew, was the 13th in descent from this Thamus, and was obviously an object of execration to those whose country the latter so thoroughly ravaged at the time in question. Where then is their wisdom? Here is a man that they ought to crown, even if he had slain the other intentionally, and yet they refuse to purge him of a murder which he committed involuntarily on their behalf." The youth then was astounded, and said, "Stranger, who are you?" And Apollonius replied, "He whom you shall find among these naked philosophers. But as it is not allowed me by my religion to address one so stained with blood, I would ask you, my good boy, to encourage him, to tell him that he will at once be purged of guilt, if he will come to the place where I am lodging. And when the man in question came, Apollonius went through the rites over him which Empedocles and Pythagoras prescribe for the purification of such offences, and told him to return home, for that he was now pure of guilt. Chapter 6. Thence they rode out at sunrise, and arrived before midday at the academy of the naked sages, who dwell, they relate, upon a moderate-sized hill a little way from the bank of the Nile. And in point of wisdom they fall short of the Indians rather more than they excel the Egyptians. And they wear next to no clothes in the same way as people do at Athens in the heat of summer. And in their district there are few trees, and a certain grove of no great size to which they resort when they meet for the transaction of common affairs. But they do not build their shrines in one and the same place, as Indian shrines are built, but one is in one part of the hill, and another in another, all worthy of observation, according to the accounts of the Egyptians. The Nile is the chief object of their worship, for they regard this river as land and water at once. They have no need, however, of hut or dwelling, because they live in the open air, directly under the heaven itself. But they have built a hospice to accommodate strangers, and it is a portico of no great size, about equal in length to those of Elis, beneath which the athletes await the sound of a midday trumpet. Chapter 7. At this place Damis records an action of Euphrates, which, if we do not regard it as juvenile, was anyhow unworthy of the dignity of a philosopher. Euphrates had heard Apollonius often say that he wished to compare the wisdom of India with that of Egypt, so he sent up to the naked sages one Thrasybulus, a native of Nancratis, to take away our sage's character. Thrasybulus, at the same time that he pretended to have come there in order to enjoy their society, told them that the sage of Tyana also would presently arrive, and that they would have no little trouble with him, because he esteemed himself more highly than the sages of India did themselves, though he extolled the latter whenever he opened his mouth. And he added that Apollonius had contrived 1,000 pitfalls for them, and that he would not allow any sort of influence either to the sun, or to the sky, or to the earth, but pretended to move, and juggle, and rearrange these forces for whatever end he chose. Chapter 8. Having concocted these stories, the man of Naucratis went away, and they, imagining they were true, did not indeed decline to meet Apollonius when he arrived, but pretended that they were occupied with important business, and were so intent upon it that they could only arrange an interview with him if they had time, and if they were informed first of what he wanted, and of what attracted him thither. And a messenger from them bade them stay and lodge in the portico. But Apollonius remarked, "We do not want to hear about a house for ourselves, for the climate here is such that anyone can live naked." An unkind reference this to them, as it implied that they went without clothes, not to show their endurance, but because it was too hot to wear any. And he added, "I am not surprised, indeed, at their not yet knowing what I want, and what I am come here for, though the Indians never asked me these questions." Chapter 9. Accordingly, Apollonius lay down under one of the trees, and let his companions who were there with him ask whatever question they pleased. But Damis took Timasion apart, and asked him the question in private. "About these naked sages, my good fellow, as you have lived with them, and in all probability know, tell me what their wisdom comes to." "It is," answered the other, "manifold and profound." "And yet," said Damis, "their demeanor towards us does not evince any wisdom, my fine fellow, for when they refuse to converse about wisdom with so great a man as our master, and assume all sorts of airs against him. What can I say of them, except they are too vain and proud?" "Pride and vanity," said the other. "I have already come among them twice, and I never saw any such thing about them, for they were always very modest and courteous towards those who came to visit them. At any rate, a little time ago, perhaps a matter of 50 days, one Thrasybulus was staying here, who achieved nothing remarkable in philosophy, and they received him with open arms, merely because he said he was a disciple of Euphrates." Then Damis cried, "What's that you say, my boy?" "Then you saw Thrasybulus of Naucratis in this academy of theirs?" "Yes, and what's more," answered the other, "I conveyed him hence when he went down the river in my own boat." "Now I have it by Athena!" cried Damis in a loud tone of indignation. "I warrant he has played some dirty trick." Timasion then replied, "Your master, when I asked him yesterday who he was, would not answer me at once, but kept his name a secret. But do you, unless this is a mystery, tell me who he is? For then I could probably help you to find what you seek." And when he heard from Damis that it was the sage of Tyana, he said, "You have put the matter in a nutshell. For Thrasybulus, as he descended the Nile with me, in answer to my question, that he had gone up therefore, explained to me that his love of wisdom was not genuine, and said that he had filled these naked sages here with suspicion of Apollonius, to the end that, whenever he came here, they might flout him. And what his quarrel is with him I know not, but anyhow it is, I think, worthy of a woman or of a vulgar person to backbite him as he has done. But I will address myself to these people, and ascertain their real disposition, for they are friendly to me." And about eventide, Timasion returned, though without telling Apollonius any more than that he had interchanged words with them. However, he told Damis in private that they meant to come the next morning, primed with all that they had learned from Thrasybulus. Chapter 10. They spent that evening conversing about trifles which are not worth recording, and then they lay down to sleep on the spot where they had supped. But at daybreak Apollonius, after adoring the sun according to his custom, had set himself to meditate upon some problem, when Nilus, who was the youngest of the naked philosophers, running up to him, exclaimed, "We are coming to you." Apollonius said, "Quite right, for to get to you I have made this long journey from the sea all the way here." And with these words he followed Nilus. So, after exchanging greetings with the sages, and they met him close to the portico, Apollonius said, "Where shall we hold the interview?" "Here," said Thespesione, pointing to the grove. Now Thespesione was the eldest of the sect, and presided over them all. And they followed him with an orderly and leisurely step, just as the jury of the athletic sports at Olympia follow the eldest of their number. And when they had sat down, which they did anyhow, and without observing their previous order, they all fixed their eyes on Thespesione as the one who should regale them with a discourse, which he proceeded to do as follows. "They say, Apollonius, that you have visited the Pythian and Olympic festivals, for this was reported of you here by Stratocles of Pharos, who says that he met you there. Now those who come to the Pythian festival are, they say, escorted with sound of pipe and song and lyre, and are honored with shows of comedies and tragedies. And then, last of all, they are presented with an exhibition of games and races run by naked athletes. At the Olympic festival, however, these superfluities are omitted as inappropriate and unworthy of the place, and those who go to the festival are only provided with a show of naked athletes originally instituted by Heracles. You may see the same contrast between the wisdom of the Indians and our own. For they, like those who invite others to the Pythian festival, appeal to the crowd with all sorts of charms and wizardry. But we, like the athletes of Olympia, go naked. Here the earth strews for us no couches, nor does it yield us milk or wine as if we were bacchantes, nor does the air uplift us and sustain us aloft. But the earth beneath us is our only couch, and we live by partaking of its natural fruits, which we would have it yield to us gladly and without being tortured against its will. But you shall see that we are not unable to work tricks if we like. Hey, you tree, yonder, he cried, pointing to an elm tree, the third in the row from that under which they were talking. Just salute the wise Apollonius, will you? And forthwith the tree saluted him, as it was bidden to do, in accents which were articulate and like those of a woman. Now he wrought this sign to discredit the Indians, and in the belief that by doing so he would wean Apollonius of his excessive estimate of their powers, for he was always recounting to everybody what the Indians said and did. Then the Egyptian added these precepts. He said that it is sufficient for the sage to abstain from eating all flesh of living animals, and from the roving desires which mount up into the soul through the eyes, and from envy which ends by teaching injustice to hand and will, and that truth stands not in need of miracle-mongering and sinister arts. He said, "For look at Apollo of Delphi, who keeps the center of Hellas for the utterance of his oracles. There, then, as you probably know yourself, a person who desires a response puts his questions briefly, and Apollo tells what he knows without any miraculous display. And yet it would be just as easy for him to convulse the whole mountain of Parnassus, and to alter the springs of the Castilian fountain so that it should run with wine, and to check the river Cephisus and stay its stream. But he reveals the bare truth without any of this show or ostentation. Nor must we suppose that it is by his will that so much gold and showy offering enter his treasury, nor that he would care for his temple even if it were made twice as large as it already is. For once on a time this god Apollo dwelt in quite a humble habitation, and a little hut was constructed for him, to which the bees are said to have contributed their honeycomb and wax, and the birds their feathers. For simplicity is the teacher of wisdom, and the teacher of truth, and you must embrace it if you would have men think you really wise, and forget all your legendary tales that you acquired among the Indians. For what need is there to beat the drum over such simple matters as, do this, or do not do it, or I know it, or I do not know it, or it is this and not that? What do you want with thunder? Nay, I would say, what do you want to be thunderstruck for? You have seen in picture books the representation of Hercules by Prodicus. In it, Hercules is represented as a youth who has not yet chosen the life he will lead. And vice and virtue stand on each side of him, plucking his garments and trying to draw him to themselves. Vice is adorned with gold and necklaces and with purple raiment, and her cheeks are painted, and her hair delicately plaited, and her eyes underlined with henna. And she also wears golden slippers, for she is pictured strutting about in these. But virtue in the picture resembles a woman worn out with toil, with a pinched look, and she has chosen for her adornment rough squalor, and she goes without shoes and in the plainest of raiment. And she would have appeared naked if she had not too much regard for feminine decency. Now figure yourself, Apollonius, as standing between Indian wisdom on one side and our own humble wisdom on the other. Imagine that you hear the one telling you how she will strew flowers under you when you lie down to sleep. Yes, by heaven, how she will regale you upon milk, and nourish you on honeycomb, and how she will supply you with nectar and wings whenever you want them, and how she will wheel in tripods whenever you drink, and golden thrones. And you shall have no hard work to do, but everything will be flung unsought into your lap. But the other discipline insists that you must lie on the bare ground in squalor, and be seen to toil naked like ourselves, and that you must not find dear or sweet anything which you have not won by hard work, and that you must not be boastful, nor hunt after vanities and pursue pride, and that you must be on your guard against all dreams and visions which lift you off the earth. If then you really make the choice of Hercules, and steel your will resolutely neither to dishonor truth, nor to decline the simplicity of nature, then you may say that you have overcome many lions, and have cut off the heads of many hydras and monsters like Geryon and Nessus, and have accomplished all his other labors. But if you embrace the life of a strolling juggler, you will flatter men's eyes and ears, but they will thank you no wiser than anybody else, and you will become the vanquished of any naked philosopher of Egypt. End of Volume 2, Book 6, Chapters 1 through 10. Volume 2, Book 6, Chapters 11 through 20 of the Life of Apollonius of Tyana. The Life of Apollonius of Tyana by Flavius Philostratus. Translated by F.C. Conybeare. Volume 2, Book 6. Chapter 11. When he ended, all turned their eyes upon Apollonius, his own followers knowing well that he would reply, while Thespesion's friends wondered what he could say in answer. But he, after praising the fluency and vigor of the Egyptian, merely said, "Have you anything more to say?" Said the other, "No, by Zeus, for I have said all I have to say." Then he said afresh, "And has not any one of the rest of the Egyptians anything to say?" Answered his antagonist, "I am their spokesman, and you have heard them all." Apollonius accordingly paused for a minute, and then, fixing his eyes, as it were, on the discourse he had heard, he spoke as follows. "You have very well described, and in a sound philosophic spirit, the choice which Prodicus declares Hercules to have made as a young man. But, ye wise men of the Egyptians, it does not apply in the least to myself. For I am not come here to ask your advice how to live, insomuch as I long ago made choice of the life which seemed best to myself, and as I am older than any of you, except Thespesion, I myself am better qualified, now I have got here, to advise you how to choose wisdom, if I did not find that you had already made the choice. Being, however, as old as I am, and so far advanced in wisdom as I am, I shall not hesitate, as it were, to make you the auditors of my life and motives, and teach you that I rightly chose this life of mine, than which no better one has ever suggested itself to me. For I discerned a certain sublimity in the discipline of Pythagoras, and how a certain secret wisdom enabled him to know, not only who he was himself, but also who he had been. And I saw that he approached the altars in purity, and suffered not his belly to be polluted by partaking of the flesh of animals, and that he kept his body pure of all garments woven of dead animal refuse, and that he was the first of mankind to restrain his tongue, inventing a discipline of silence described in the proverbial phrase, "An ox sits upon it." I also saw that his philosophical system was in other respects oracular and true. So I ran to embrace his teachings, not choosing one form of wisdom rather than another of two presented to me, as you, my excellent Thespesion, advise me to do. For philosophy marshalled before me her various points of view, investing them with the adornment proper to each, and she commanded me to look upon them and make a sound choice. Now they were all possessed of an august and divine beauty, and some of them were of such dazzling brightness that you might well have closed your eyes. However, I fixed my eyes firmly upon all of them, for they themselves encouraged me to do so by moving towards me and telling me beforehand how much they would give me. Well, one of them professed that she would shower upon me a swarm of pleasures without any toil on my part, and another that she would give me rest after toil, and a third that she would mingle mirth and merriment in my toil. And everywhere I had glimpses of pleasures and of unrestrained indulgence in the pleasures of the table, and it seemed that I had only to stretch out my hand to be rich, and that I needed not to set any bridle upon my eyes, but love and loose desire and such like feelings were freely allowed me. One of them, however, boasted that she would restrain me from such things, but she was bold and abusive, and in an unabashed manner elbowed all others aside. And I beheld the ineffable form of wisdom, which long ago conquered the soul of Pythagoras, and she stood, I may tell you, not among the many, but kept herself apart and in silence. And when she saw that I ranged not myself with the rest, though as yet I knew not what were her wares, she said, "Young man, I am unpleasing and a lady full of sorrows. For if anyone betakes himself to my abode, he must of his own choice put away all dishes which contain the flesh of living animals, and he must forget wine, nor make muddy therewith the cup of wisdom which is set in the souls of those that drink no wine. Nor shall blanket keep him warm, nor wool shorn from a living animal. But I allow him shoes of bark, and he must sleep anywhere and anyhow. And if I find my votaries yielding to sensual pleasures, I have precipices to which justice that waits upon wisdom carries them and pushes them over, and I am so harsh to those who make choice of my discipline that I have bits ready to restrain their tongues. But learn from me what rewards you shall reap by enduring all this, temperance and justice unsought and at once, and the faculty to regard no man with envy, and to be dreaded by tyrants rather than cringe at them, and to have your humble offerings appear sweeter to the gods than the offerings of those who pour out before them the blood of bulls. And when you are pure, I will grant you the faculty and foreknowledge, and I will so fill your eyes with light that you shall distinguish a god and recognize a hero, and detect and put to shame the shadowy phantoms which disguise themselves in the form of men. This was the life I chose, ye wise of the Egyptians. It was a sound choice, and in the spirit of Pythagoras. And in making it, I neither deceived myself nor was deceived. For I have become all that a philosopher should become, and all that she promised to bestow upon the philosopher, that is mine. For I have studied profoundly the problem of the rise of the art, and whence it draws its first principles, and I have realized that it belongs to men of transcendent religious gifts, who have thoroughly investigated the nature of the soul, the wellsprings of whose existence lie back in the immortal and in the unbegotten. Now I agree that this doctrine was wholly alien to the Athenians, for when Plato in their city lifted up his voice and discoursed upon the soul, full of inspiration and wisdom, they cavilled against him and adopted opinions of the soul opposed thereto and altogether false. And one may well ask whether there is any city or any race of men where not one more and another less, but wherein men of all ages alike will enunciate the same doctrine of the soul. And I myself, because my youth and inexperience so inclined me, began by looking up to yourselves, because you had the reputation of an extraordinary knowledge of most things. But when I explained my views to my own teacher, he interrupted me and said as follows: "Supposing you were in a passionate mood, and being of an impressionable age, were inclined to form a friendship. And suppose you met a handsome youth and admired his looks, and you asked whose son he was. And suppose he were the son of a knight or a general, and that his grandparents had been furnishers of a chorus. If, then, you dubbed him the child of some skipper or policeman, do you suppose that you would thereby be the more likely to captivate his affections, and that you would not rather make yourself odious to him by refusing to call him by his father's name, and giving him instead that of some ignoble and spurious parent? If, then, you were enamored of the wisdom which the Indians discovered, would you call it not by the name which its natural parents bore, but by the name of its adoptive sires, and so confer upon the Egyptians a greater boon than if that were to happen over again which their own poets relate, namely, if the Nile, on reaching its full, were found to be with honey blent? It was this which turned my steps to the Indians rather than to yourselves. For I reflected that they were more subtle in their understanding, because such men as they live in contact with a purer daylight, and entertain truer opinions of nature and of the gods, because they are near unto the latter, and live on the edge and confines of that thermal essence which quickens all unto life. And when I came among them, their message made the same impression upon me as the talent of Aeschylus is said to have made upon the Athenians. For he was a poet of tragedy, and finding the art to be rude and inchoate, and as yet not in the least elaborated, he went to work, and curtailed the prolixity of the chorus, and invented dialogues for the actors, discarding the long monodies of the earlier time, and he hit upon a plan of killing people behind the stage, instead of their being slain before the eyes of the audience. Well, if we cannot deny his talent in making all these improvements, we must nevertheless admit that they might have suggested themselves equally well to an inferior dramatist. But his talent was twofold. On the one hand, as a poet, he set himself to make his diction worthy of tragedy. On the other hand, as a manager, to adapt his stage to sublime rather than to humble and groveling themes. Accordingly, he devised masks which represented the forms of the heroes, and he mounted his actors on buskins so that their gait might correspond to the characters they played. And he was the first to devise stage dresses which might convey an adequate impression to the audience of the heroes and heroines they saw. For all these reasons, the Athenians accounted him to be the father of tragedy, and even after his death they continued to invite him to represent his plays at the Dionysiac festival, for, in accordance with public decree, the plays of Aeschylus continued to be put upon the stage and win the prize anew. And yet, the gratification of a well-staged tragedy is insignificant, for its pleasures last a brief day, as brief as is the season of the Dionysiac festival. But the gratification of a philosophic system, devised to meet the requirements of a Pythagoras, and also breathing the inspiration in which Pythagoras was anticipated by the Indians, lasts not for a brief time, but for an endless and incalculable period. It is then not unreasonable on my part, I think, to have devoted myself to a philosophy so highly elaborated, and to one which, to use a metaphor from the stage, the Indians mount, as it deserves to be mounted, upon a lofty and divine mechanism, and then wheel it forth upon the stage. And that I was right to admire them, and that I am right in considering them to be wise and blessed, it is now time to convince you. I beheld men dwelling upon the earth, and yet not upon it. I beheld them fortified without fortifications. I beheld them possessed of nothing, and yet possessed of all things. You will say that I have taken to riddles, but the wisdom of Pythagoras allows of this, for he taught us to speak in riddles, when he discovered that the word is the teacher of silence. And there was a time when you yourselves took counsel with Pythagoras, and were advocates of this same wisdom. That was in the time when you could say nothing too good of the Indian philosophy. For to begin with, and of old, you were Indians. Subsequently, because your soil was wrath with you, you came hither, and then, ashamed of the reasons owing to which you quitted it, you tried to get men to regard you as anything rather than Ethiopians who had come from India hither, and you took every pains to efface your past. This is why you stripped yourselves of the apparel in which you came thence, as if you were anxious to doff along with it your Ethiopian nationality. This is why you have resolved to worship the gods in the Egyptian rather than in your own fashion, and why you have set yourselves to disseminate unflattering stories of the Indians, as if in maligning them you did not foul your own nest. And in this respect you have not yet altered your tone for the better, for only today you have given here an exhibition of your propensities for abuse and satire, pretending that the Indians are no better employed than in startling people and in pandering to their eyes and ears. And because as yet you are ignorant of my wisdom, you show yourselves indifferent to the fame which crowns it. Well, in defense of myself, I do not mean to say anything, for I am content to be what the Indians think me, but I will not allow them to be attacked. And if you are so sound and sane as to possess any tincture of the wisdom of the man of Hymera, who composed, in honor of Helen, a poem which contradicted a former one, and called it a palinode, it is high time for you also to use the words he used, and say, "This discourse of ours is not true," so changing your opinion and adopting one better than you at present entertain about these people. But if you have not the wit to recant, you must at least spare men to whom the gods vouchsafe, as worthy of them, their own prerogatives, and whose possessions they do not disdain for themselves. You have also, Thespesione, made some remarks about the simplicity and freedom from pomp which characterizes the Pythian oracle, and by way of example, you instanced the temple composed of wax and feathers. But I do not myself find that even this devoid of pomp, for we have the line, "O birds, bring hither your wings, and bees your wax." Such language betokens a carefully prepared home and the form of house. And the god, I believe, regarded even this as too humble and below the dignity of his wisdom, and therefore desired to have another and yet another temple, big ones these, and 100 feet in breadth, and from one of them it is said that golden figures of wryneck were hung up which possessed in a manner the charm of the sirens. And the god collected the most precious of the offerings into the Pythian temple for ornament. Nor did he reject works of statuary, when their authors brought him to his temple colossal figures both of gods and men, and also of horses, oxen, and other animals. Nor did he refuse the gift which Glaucus brought thither of a stand for a goblet, nor the picture of the taking of the citadel of Ilium which Polygnotus painted there. For I imagine he did not consider that the gold of Lydia really beautified the Pythian fane, but he admitted it on behalf of the Hellens themselves, by way of pointing out to them, I believe, the immense riches of the barbarians, and inducing them to covet that, rather than continue to ravage one another's lands. And he accordingly adopted the Greek fashion of art which suited his peculiar wisdom, and adorned his shrine therewith. And I believe that it was by way of adornment that he also puts his oracles into metrical form. For if he did not wish to make a show in this matter, he would surely make his responses in such forms as the following: do this, or do not do that, and go, or do not go, or choose allies, or do not choose them. For here are short formulas, or, as you call it, naked ones. But in order to display his mastery of the grand style, and in order to please those who came to consult his oracle, he adopted the poetical form, and he does not allow that anything exists which he does not know, but claims to have counted the sands of the sea, and to know their number, and also to have fathomed the depths of the sea. But I suppose you will call it miracle-mongering that Apollo dictates his oracles with such proud dignity and elation of spirit. But if you will not be annoyed, Thespesione, at what I say, there are certain old women who go about with sieves in their hands to shepherds, sometimes to cowherds, pretending to heal their flocks when they are sick, by divination, as they call it. And they claim to be called wise women, yea, wiser than those who are unfeignedly prophets. It seems to me that you are in the same case, when I contrast your wisdom with that of the Indians, for they are divine, and have trimmed and adorned their science after the manner of the Pythian oracle. But you, however, I will say no more, for modesty in speech is as dear to me as it is dear to the Indians, and I would be glad to have it at once to attend upon and to guide my tongue, seeking to compass what is in my power when I am praising those to whom I am so devoted, but leaving alone what is too high for me to attain unto, without bespattering it with petty disapproval. But you, no doubt, delight in the story which you have read in Homer about the Cyclops, how their land, all unsown and unploughed, nourished the most fearless and most lawless of beings. And if it is some Edoni or Lydians who are conducting their Bacchic revels, you are quite ready to believe that the earth will supply them with fountains of milk and wine, and give them to drink thereof. But you would deny to these Indians, lovers of all wisdom as enthusiastic as ever Bacchants were, the unsought bounties which earth offers them. Moreover, tripods, gifted with wills of their own, attend the banquets of the gods also. And Ares, ignorant and hostile as he was to Hephaestus, yet never accused him merely for making them. Nor is it conceivable that the gods ever listened to such an indictment as this: You commit an injustice, O Hephaestus, in adorning the banquet of the gods, and encompassing it with miracles. Nor was Hephaestus ever sued for constructing handmaids of gold, nor accused of debasing the metals because he made the gold to breathe. For every art is interested to adorn, and the very existence of the arts was a discovery made in behalf of adornment. Moreover, a man who goes without shoes and wears a philosopher's cloak and hangs a wallet on his back is a creature of adornment, nay, more even the nakedness which you affect, in spite of its rough and plain appearance, has for its object adornment and decoration, though here too there is not absent a certain element of what they call empty pride. we must judge by the same standard the religion of the sun and the national rites of the Indians, and any cult in which the god delights. For the subterranean gods will always prefer deep trenches and ceremonies conducted in the hollows of the earth. But the air is the chariot of the sun, and those who would sing his praise in a fitting manner must rise from the earth and soar aloft with the god. And this everyone would like to do, but the Indians alone are able to do it. Chapter 12. Damis says that he breathed afresh when he heard this address, for that the Egyptians were so impressed by Apollonius's words, that Thesprosion, in spite of the blackness of his complexion, visibly blushed, while the rest of them seemed in some way stunned by the vigorous and fluent discourse which they listened to. But the youngest of them, whose name was Nilus, leapt up from the ground, he says, in admiration, and passing over to Apollonius, shook hands with him, and besought him to tell him about the interviews which he had had with the Indians. And Apollonius, he says, replied, "I should not grudge you anything, for you are ready to listen, as I see, and are ready to welcome wisdom of every kind. But I should not care to pour out the teachings I gathered there upon Thesprosion, or on anyone else who regards the lore of the Indians as so much nonsense." Whereupon Thesprosion said, "But if you were a merchant or a seafarer, and you brought to us some cargo or other from over there, would you claim, merely because it came from India, to dispose of it untested and unexamined, refusing us either the liberty of looking at it or tasting it?" But Apollonius replied as follows: "I should furnish it to those who asked for it. But if the moment my ship had reached the harbor, someone came down to the beach and began to run down my cargo and abuse myself, and say that I came from a country which produces nothing worth having, and if he reproached me for sailing with a cargo of shoddy goods, and tried to persuade the rest who think like himself, do you suppose that one would, after entering such a harbor, cast anchor, or make his cables fast, and not rather hoist his sails, and put out to sea afresh, entrusting his goods more gladly to the winds than to such undiscerning and inhospitable people?" Nilus said, "Well, I anyhow laid hold on your cables, and entreat you, my skipper, to let me share your goods that you bring hither, and I would gladly embark with you on your ship as a supercargo and a clerk to check your merchandise." Chapter 13. Thesprosion, however, was anxious to put a stop to such propositions, so he said, "I am glad, Apollonius, that you are annoyed at what we said to you, for you can the more readily condone our annoyance at the misrepresentation you made of our local custom, long before you had gained any experience of its quality." Apollonius was for a moment astonished at these words, for he had heard nothing as yet of the intrigues of Thrasybulus and Euphrates, but as was his wont, he guessed the truth, and said, "The Indians, O Thesprosion, would never have behaved as you have, nor have given ear to these insinuations dropped by Euphrates, for they have a gift of prescience. Now I never had any quarrel of my own with Euphrates. I only tried to warn him of his passion for money, and cure his propensity to value everything by what he could make out of it. But I found that my advice was not congenial to him, nor in his case practical. Nay, he merely takes it as a tacit reproach, and never loses any opportunity of intriguing against me. But since you have found his attacks upon my character so plausible, I may as well tell you that it is you rather than myself that he has calumniated. For though, as is clear to me, the victims of calumny incur considerable dangers, since they are, I suppose, sure to be disliked without having done any wrong, yet neither are those who incline to listen to the calumnies free from danger. For in the first place they will be convicted of paying respect to lies, and giving them as much attention as they would to the truth. And secondly, they are convicted of levity and credulity, faults which it is disgraceful even for a stripling to fall into. And they will be thought envious, because they allow envy to teach them to listen to unjust tittle-tattle, and they expose themselves all the more to calumny, because they think it true of others. For man is by nature inclined to commit a fault which he does not discredit when he hears it related of others. Heaven forbid that a man of these inclinations should become a tyrant, or even president of a popular state. For in his hands even a democracy would become a tyranny. Nor let him be made a judge, for surely he will not ever discern the truth. Nor let him be captain of a ship, for the crew would mutiny. Nor general of an army, for that would bring luck to the adversary. Nor let one of his disposition attempt philosophy, for he would not consider the truth in forming his opinions. But Euphrates has deprived you of even the quality of wisdom. For how can those on whom he has imposed with his falsehoods claim wisdom for themselves? Have they not deserted from it to take sides with one who has persuaded them of improbabilities? Here Thespion tried to calm him and remarked, "Enough of Euphrates and of his small-minded affairs, for we are quite ready even to reconcile you with him, since we consider it the proper work of a sage to be umpire in the disputes of other sages." "But," said Apollonius, "who shall reconcile me with you? For the victim of lies must surely be driven into hostility by the falsehood." "Be it so," said Apollonius, "and let us hold a conversation, for that will be the best way of reconciling us." Chapter 14. And Nilus, as he was passionately anxious to listen to Apollonius, said, "And what's more, it behooves you to begin the conversation, to tell us all about the journey you made to the people of India, and about the conversations which you held there, I have no doubt, on the most brilliant topics." "And I too," said Thespesión, "long to hear about the wisdom of Phraortes. For you are said to have brought from India some examples of his arguments." Apollonius accordingly began by telling them about the events which occurred in Babylon, and told them everything, and they gladly listened to him, spellbound by his words. But when it was midday, they broke off the conversation, for at this time of the day the naked sages, like others, attend to the ceremonies of religion. Chapter 15. Apollonius and his comrades were about to dine, when Nilus presented himself with vegetables and bread and dried fruits, some of which he carried himself, while his friends carried the rest. And very politely he said, "The sages send these gifts of hospitality, not only to yourselves, but to me. For I mean to share in your repast, not uninvited, as they say, but inviting myself." "It is a delightful gift of hospitality," said Apollonius, "which you bring to us, O youth, in the shape of yourself and of your disposition. For you are evidently a philosopher without guile, and an enthusiastic lover of the doctrines of the Indians and of Pythagoras. So lie down here and eat with us." "I will do so," said the other, "but your dishes will not be ample enough to satisfy me." "It seems to me," said the other, "that you are a gourmand and an appalling eater." "None like me," said the other, "for although you have set before me so ample and so brilliant a repast, I am not sated, and after a little time I am come back again to eat afresh. What then can you call me but an insatiable cormorant?" "Eat your fill," said Apollonius, "and as for topics of conversation, some you must yourself supply, and I will give you others." Chapter 16. So when they had dined, Nilus said, "I until now have been camping together with the naked sages, and joined my forces with them, as with certain light-armed troops or slingers. But now I intend to put on my heavy armor, and it is your shield that shall adorn me." "But," said Apollonius, "I think, my good Egyptian, that you will incur the censure of Thespesian and his society for 2 reasons. Firstly, that after no further examination and testing of yourselves, you have left them; and secondly, that you give the preference to our manners, and discipline with more precipitancy than is admissible where a man is making choice of how he shall live. I agree with you, said the young man, but if I am to blame for making this choice, I might also be to blame if I did not make it. And anyhow, they will be most open to rebuke if they make the same choice as myself. For it will be more justly reprehensible in them, as they are both older and wiser than myself, not to have made the choice long ago, which I make now. For with all their advantages, they will have failed to choose what in practice would so much rebound to their advantage. A very generous sentiment indeed, my good youth, is this which you have expressed, said Apollonius. But beware, lest the mere fact of their being so wise and aged should give them an appearance, at any rate, of being right in choosing as they have done, and of having good reason for rejecting my doctrine, and lest you should seem to take up a very bold position in setting them to rights rather than in following them. But the Egyptian turned short round upon Apollonius, and countering his opinion, said, So far as it was right for a young man to agree with his elders, I have been careful to do so. For so long as I thought that these gentlemen were possessed of a wisdom which belonged to no other set of men, I attached myself to them, and the motive which actuated me to do so was the following. My father once made a voyage on his own initiative to the Red Sea, for he was, I may tell you, captain of the ship which the Egyptians send to the Indies. And after he had had intercourse with the Indians of the seaboard, he brought home stories of the wise men of that region, closely similar to those which you have told us. And his account which I heard was somewhat as follows, namely, that the Indians are the wisest of mankind, but that the Egyptians are colonists sent from India, who follow their forefathers in matters of wisdom, and fix their eyes on the institutions of their home. Well, I, having reached my teens, surrendered my patrimony to those who wanted it more than myself, and frequented the society of these naked sages, naked myself as they, in the hope of picking up the teaching of the Indians, or at any rate teaching allied to theirs. And they certainly appeared to me to be wise, though not after the manner of India. But when I asked them point blank why they did not teach the philosophy of India, they plunged into abuse of the natives of that country, very much as you have heard them do in their speeches this very day. Now I was still young, as you see, so they made me a member of their society, because I imagine they were afraid I might hastily quit them and undertake a voyage to the Red Sea, as my father did before me. And I should certainly have done so. Yes, by heaven, I would have pushed on until I reached the hill of the sages, unless some one of the gods had sent you hither to help me, and enabled me, without either making any voyage over the sea, or adventuring to the inhabitants of the Gulf, to taste the wisdom of India. It is not today, therefore, for the first time, that I shall make my choice, but I made it long ago, though I did not obtain what I hoped to obtain. For what is there to wonder at if a man who has missed what he was searching for returns to the search? And if I should convert my friends yonder to this point of view, and persuade them to accept the convictions which I have adopted myself, should I, tell me, be guilty of any hardihood? For you must not reject the claim that youth makes, that in some way it assimilates an idea more easily than old age, and anyone who counsels another to adopt the wisdom and teaching which he himself has chosen, anyhow escapes the imputation of trying to persuade others of things he does not believe himself. And anyone who takes the blessings bestowed upon him by fortune into a corner, and there enjoys them by himself, violates their character as blessings, for he prevents their sweetness from being enjoyed by as many as possible. Chapter 17. When Nilus had finished these arguments, and juvenile enough they were, Apollonius took him up and said, "If you are in love with my wisdom, had you not better, before I begin, discuss with me the question of my reward?" "Let us discuss it," answered Nilus, "and do you ask whatever you like." "I ask you," he said, "to be content with the choice you have made, and not to annoy the naked sages by giving them advice which they will not take." "I consent," he said, "and let this be agreed upon as your reward." This, then, was the substance of their conversation, and when Nilus at its close asked him how long a time he would stay among the naked sages, he replied, "So long as the quality of their wisdom justifies anyone in remaining in their company. And after that I shall take my way to the cataracts, in order to see the springs of the Nile, for it will be delightful not only to behold the sources of the Nile, but also to listen to the roar of its waterfalls." Chapter 18. After they had held this discussion, and listened to some recollections of India, they lay down to sleep upon the grass. But at daybreak, having offered their accustomed prayers, they followed Nilus, who led them into the presence of Thespesión. They accordingly greeted one another, and sitting down together in the grove, they began a conversation in which Apollonius led as follows. "How important it is," said he, "not to conceal wisdom, is proved by our conversation of yesterday. For because the Indians taught me as much of their wisdom as I thought it proper for me to know, I not only remember my teachers, but I go about instilling into others what I heard from them. And you too will be richly rewarded by me, if you send me away with a knowledge of your wisdom as well, for I shall not cease to go about and repeat your teachings to the Greeks, while to the Indians I shall write them." Chapter 19. "Ask," they said, "for you know question comes first, and argument follows on it." And Apollonius said, "It is about the gods that I would like to ask you a question first, namely, what induced you to impart, as your tradition, to the people of this country forms of the gods that are absurd and grotesque in all but a few cases? In a few cases, do I say? I would rather say that in a very few are the gods' images fashioned in a wise and godlike manner, for the mass of your shrines seem to have been erected in honor rather of irrational and ignoble animals than of gods." Thespesión, resenting these remarks, said, "And your own images in Greece, how are they fashioned?" "In the way," he replied, "in which it is best and most reverent to construct images of the gods." "I suppose you allude," said the other, "to the statue of Zeus in Olympia, and to the image of Athena, and to that of the Cnidian goddess, and to that of the Argive goddess, and to the other images equally beautiful and full of charm." "Not only to these," replied Apollonius, "but without exception I maintain that whereas in other lands statuary has scrupulously observed decency and fitness, you rather make ridicule of the gods than really believe in them." "Your artists, then, like Phidias," said the other, "and like Praxiteles, went up, I suppose, to heaven, and took a copy of the forms of the gods, and then reproduced these by their art. Or was there any other influence which presided over and guided their moulding?" "There was," said Apollonius, "and an influence pregnant with wisdom and genius." "What was that?" said the other, "for I do not think you can adduce any except imitation." Apollonius said, "Imagination wrought these works, a wiser and subtler artist by far than imitation. For imitation can only create as its handiwork what it has seen, but imagination equally what it has not seen, for it will conceive of its ideal with reference to the reality, and imitation is often baffled by terror, but imagination by nothing, for it marches undismayed to the goal which it has itself laid down. When you entertain a notion of Zeus, you must, I suppose, envisage him along with heaven and seasons and stars, as Phidias in his day endeavoured to do. And if you would fashion an image of Athena, you must image in your mind armies and cunning and handicrafts, and how she leapt out of Zeus himself. But if you make a hawk, or an owl, or a wolf, or a dog, and put it in your temples instead of Hermes, or Athena, or Apollo, your animals and your birds may be esteemed and of much price as likeness, but the gods will be very much lowered in their dignity. I think, said the other, that you criticize our religion very superficially. For if the Egyptians had any wisdom, they show it by their deep respect and reverence in the representation of the gods, and by the circumstance that they fashion their forms as symbols of a profound inner meaning, so as to enhance their solemnity and august character. Apollonius thereupon merely laughed and said, My good friends, you have indeed greatly profited by the wisdom of Egypt and Ethiopia, if your dog and your ibis and your goat seem particularly august and godlike. For this is what I learned from Thespesian the sage. But what is there that is august or awe-inspiring in these images? It is not likely that perjurers and temple thieves and all the rabble of low jesters will despise such holy objects rather than dread them. And if they are to be held august for the hidden meanings which they convey, surely the gods in Egypt would have met with much greater reverence, if no images of them had ever been set up at all, and if you had planned your theology along other lines wiser and more mysterious. For I imagine you might have built temples for them, and have fixed the altars, and laid down rules about what to sacrifice and what not, and when and on what scale, and with what liturgies and rites, without introducing any image at all, but leaving it to those who frequented the temples to imagine the images of the gods. For the mind can more or less delineate and figure them to itself better than can any artist. But you have denied the gods the privilege of beauty both of the outer eye and of inner suggestion. Thespesian replied and said, There was a certain Athenian called Socrates, a foolish old man like ourselves, who thought that the dog and the goose and the plane tree were gods, and used to swear by them. He was not foolish, said Apollonius, but a divine and unfeignedly wise man, for he did not swear by these objects on the understanding that they were gods, but to save himself from swearing by the gods. Chapter 20. Thereupon Thespesian, as if anxious to drop this subject, put some questions to Apollonius about the scourging in Sparta, and asked if the Lacedaemonians were smitten with rods in public. Yes, answered the other, as hard, O Thespesian, as men can smite them, and it is especially men of noble and distinguished birth among them that are so treated. Then what did they do to the menials, he asked, when they do wrong? They do not kill them nowadays, said Apollonius, as Lycurgus formerly allowed, but the same whip is used to them too. And what judgment does Hellas pass upon the matter? They flock, he answered, to see the spectacle with pleasure and utmost enthusiasm, as if to the festival of Hyacinthus, or to that of the naked boys. Then these excellent Helens are not ashamed, either to behold those publicly whipped who erewhile governed them, or to reflect that they were governed by men who are whipped before the eyes of all? And how is it that you did not reform this abuse? For they say that you are interested yourself in the affairs of the Lacedaemonians, as of other people. So far as anything could be reformed, I gave them my advice, and they readily adopted it, for they are the freest of the Hellenes. But at the same time, they will only listen to one who gives them good advice. Now the custom of scourging is a ceremony in honor of the Scythian Artemis, so they say, as was prescribed by oracles, and to oppose the regulations of the gods is in my opinion utter madness. 'Tis a poor wisdom, Apollonius, he replied, which you attribute to the gods of the Hellenes, if they countenance scourging as a part of the discipline of freedom. It's not the scourging, he said, but the sprinkling of the altar with human blood that is important. For the Scythians, too, held the altar to be worthy thereof. But the Lacedaemonians modified the ceremony of sacrifice because of its implacable cruelty, and turned it into a contest of endurance, undergone without any loss of life, and yet securing to the goddess as first fruits an offering of their own blood. Why then, said the other, do they not sacrifice strangers right out to Artemis, as the Scythians formerly considered it right to do? Because, he answered, it is not congenial to any of the Greeks to adopt in their full rigor the manners and customs of barbarians. And yet, said the other, it seems to me that it would be more humane to sacrifice one or two of them than to enforce as they do a policy of exclusion against all foreigners. Let us not assail, said the other, O Thespesion, the lawgiver Lycurgus, but we must understand him, and then we shall see that his prohibition to strangers to settle in Sparta and live there was not inspired on his part by mere boorish exclusiveness, but by a desire to keep the institutions of Sparta in their original purity, by preventing outsiders from mingling in her life. Well, said the other, I should allow the men of Sparta to be what they claim to be, if they had ever lived with strangers, and yet had faithfully adhered to their home principles. For it was not by keeping true to themselves in the absence of strangers, but by doing so in spite of their presence, that they needed to show their superiority. But they, although they enforced this policy of excluding strangers, corrupted their institutions, and were found doing exactly the same as did those of the Greeks, whom they most detested. Anyhow, their subsequent naval program and policy of imposing tribute was modeled entirely upon that of Athens, and they themselves ended by committing acts which they had themselves regarded as a just casus belli against the Athenians, whom they had no sooner beaten in the field than they humbly adopted, as if they were the beaten party, their pet institution. And the very fact that the goddess was introduced from Taurus and Scythia was the action of men who embraced alien customs. But if an oracle prescribed this, what want was there of a scourge? What need to feign an endurance only fit for slaves? Had they wanted to prove the disdain that Lacedaemonians felt for death, they had, I think, done better to sacrifice a youth of Sparta with his own consent upon the altar. For this would have been a real proof of the superior courage of the Spartans, and would have disciplined Hellas from ranging herself in the opposite camp to them. But you will say that they had to save their young men for the battlefield. Well, in that case, the law which prevails among the Scythians, and sentences all men of 60 years of age to death, would have been more suitably introduced and followed among the Lacedaemonians than among the Scythians, supposing that they embrace death in its grim reality, and not as a mere parade. These remarks of mine are directed not so much against the Lacedaemonians as against yourself, O Apollonius. For if ancient institutions, whose hoary age defies our understanding of their origins, are to be examined in an unsympathetic spirit, and the reason why they are pleasing to heaven subjected to cold criticism, such a line of speculation will produce a crop of odd conclusions. For we could attack the mystery rite of Eleusis in the same way, and ask why it is this and not that. And the same with the rites of the Samothracians, for in their ritual they avoid one thing and insist on another. And the same with the Dionysiac ceremonies, and their phallic symbol, and the figure erected in Selene. And before we know where we are, we shall be picking holes in everything. Let us choose, therefore, any other topic you like, but respect the sentiment of Pythagoras, which is also our own. For it is better, if we can't hold our tongue about everything, at any rate to preserve silence about such matters as these. Apollonius replied and said, If, O Thespesian, you had wished to discuss the topic seriously, you would have found that the Lacedaemonians have many excellent arguments to advance in favour of their institutions, proving that they are sound and superior to those of other Hellenes. But, since you are so averse to continue the discussion, and even regard it as impious to talk about such things, let us proceed to another subject, of great importance, as I am convinced, for it is about justice that I shall now put a question. End of chapters 11 through 20.